This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
What I want to do today is start with a quick video clip. Although it sounds like from the hands that I saw raised, most of you have met a lot of ADHD people already, but I still want to highlight a couple of complexities from an actual child and then get into some issues.
The blood wicket. That and that, okay? I'll try to figure out in my brain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's an 8. I know it in my brain. Seven. Now I'll try to figure it out in my brain. 7 plus 2. I'd be at 7 and 2.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out in my brain.
Use your counting bar.
Counting bar! Papa, but I think I'll answer you with one single thing.
What?
I want me to do that anymore.
Focus on your math first, and then we'll talk about that. Use your counting bar. 7 plus 2.
7 plus 2. I can't figure out in my brain at all.
Use your counting bar.
Counting ball, wait. I don't know 7 1. Whoa.
Use your counting bar.
I want to do that by just wiggling.
7.
7. When I get to take a break?
When you finish that, do your 7. Use your counting bar.
Counting ball. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Very good.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's 9. But 9. Wait. Okay, I'll try to figure that in my brain.
3 plus 3? Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
No. Try again.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
All right, so I think there's several observations we can make about Logan. And probably it was pretty obvious that he had a big space out episode there where he was inattentive and not paying attention. Very characteristic. One of the complaints with individuals with ADHD is they're not listening, not because they're busy, sometimes because they're busy talking over you, but sometimes they're spacing out like that. He obviously had some motoric restlessness. But I want to point out for you, and I think an underappreciated feature, he was both kind of sleepy and out of it and overactive, hyperactive. So this is a mixture. We've got a lot of interest in low arousal versus high arousal in ADHD, kids being both sluggish and low energy as well as hyperactive, and kind of that paradox. And you can see that the energy level here is kind of bursts of activity and then and then not. So it's not just a constant running, but it's kind of this burst and then no, and then you see the impulsive outburst. You also saw here lots of corollary problems. I don't know how many of you noticed the kind of immature pencil grips. You got a little bit of motor delay there. You've obviously got language articulation problems, and as he gets older in the videotapes, you see more and more of the kind of communication problems and more of an autistic look. But in ADHD kids, even without autism, you see a lot of these associated features as well. And I want to take a minute just to remind you of some of the history of this concept. And I won't stop at every point on this timeline, but I will flag that there's been in the medical literature since about 1798, 1800. First publications in the United States were 1908 with Treadgold. But we had some mention of kids that looked a lot like ADHD kids as early as 1800, so about 200 years ago. But virtually nothing else, virtually nothing for 100 years or so. Beginning in the early 1900s, we began to see a literature on minimal brain damage, and some of this related to the encephalitis epidemic when a lot of kids got encephalitis and came out of it with hyperactivity, impulsivity syndrome that looked a lot like today's ADHD. And then on into the modern definitions of ADD in 1980, and then now ADHD, the same syndrome with a new name, in 1994, and we're currently working on DSM-5. So there's been evolving understandings to go along with these evolving names. But back when we had MBDs, either minimal brain dysfunction or minimal brain disorder, ADHD was, those categories included motor problems, sleep problems, language problems. It was really a catch-all for global developmental delays, with hyperactivity and attention being central to it. And only by about 1980 did we separate out specific language disorders and developmental coordination disorders and these other disorders. But nobody sent the memo to the kids, and so they still show up with all these problems at once a lot of times. So it's a complicated group. So in our research, in our clinical talks, and in the talk today, I'm going to focus heavily on inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity, but I want to remind you that these kids have lots of other things going on clinically that makes the picture that this is a simplification for the sake of analysis rather than a claim that this is the only important components of the syndrome. And I want to keep that in mind, especially as we think about the meaning for clinical practice of some of the features. Another piece about the phenotype, there's the inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and associated features that I just kind of alluded to quickly. There's also lots known already about the cognitive characteristics of kids with ADHD. I've just summarized here a few well-established facts, if you will, about the ADHD phenotype, characteristics of this group of children. And what I want to point out here is the cognitive features, which is the main thing that I focus on. Unlike Down syndrome, or unlike, even to a large extent, autism, certainly unlike global mental delay or intellectual delay, the cognitive problems in ADHD are not obvious all the time. They're context dependent, and they look different in different contexts. So I'll give you the first two examples here. That are kids with ADHD hasty and inaccurate? Yes, if the contextual demand is be careful and take your time. But if the contextual demand is go as fast as you can, they're slow. So the apparent deficit depends on the context problem. We've had similar arguments in the literature. So we have arguments in the literature whether they're fast or whether they're slow. We also have arguments in the literature about whether they over-respond or under-respond to rewards. Are they over-motivated by reward or indifferent to reward? Well, you'll see experiments showing both things because it depends on the context of the reward. Is it immediate or is it later? And the steepness of that discounting curve will shape the steepness of that response. And the same story applies to some other kinds of cognitive effects. But the bottom line is there is a kind of characteristic cognitive profile here that goes with this syndrome, but it doesn't apply equally to all children. And it's not strong enough effects to give us a clinical diagnostic cut point. So we really have characteristics of groups of kids, but not of individual children. We can profile a child for planning purposes, for education. It's very helpful to get these psychological scores, but diagnostically, the effects are just not big enough. So what I'm going to talk about today is a couple of themes. The first half of this talk, I'm going to talk about the concept that ADHD is not a one-size-fits-all term, that we need to better characterize subgroups under a term we use called heterogeneity, which means that there's different groups of kids with different features under this same rubric. And I'll show you some data on that. I'm going to emphasize here less the past literature and more the kind of current stuff that we're working on to give you a flavor of kind of what's coming down the pike and new findings, rather than a tutorial on past literature. So I hope that's okay with the group. So I want to caveat that you're not going to see here well-established consensus results. You're going to see new findings that we're working on that we think are important. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk a little about etiology, genes and environments. All right, so why are we worried about heterogeneity? Here's a little bit of background that makes this an important concern. First of all, we can contain the symptoms of ADHD with medications. In fact, we can do so pretty effectively. The stimulant treatment for ADHD is one of the most dramatic effects in psychiatry when it works. These kids really look a lot different when the medication is working, and it's helped a lot of kids. There's no question about that. But the literature coming out on long-term follow-up studies is continuing to disturb the field in the sense that the symptoms clearly kind of go back to baseline over time, and you don't really have a cure. And the reason for this is we don't know for sure what's causing the disorder. We don't know the pathophysiology for sure. The other problem that I just mentioned is the biological and cognitive findings are small. We don't have big enough cognitive and biological effects to be diagnostic, which suggests either that we're looking at the wrong effects, that these effects don't exist, or that we're lumping together too many different kids with different kinds of problems, and if we could separate them out, we could get bigger effects. Major gene search has failed. There's not going to be a major gene for ADHD. There's going to be lots of either different kinds of genetic disorders, or there's going to be groups of kids with different genetic effects. So I'll come back to genetics in a minute, but it's an encouragement to heterogeneity from one perspective. And then finally, there's issues with clinical variability. The DSM-4 subtypes of ADHD are not satisfactory. Our DSM-5 committee has spent a lot of energy figuring out what to do about that. They're not stable over time. They don't differentiate very well on external correlates. There's a question of a group of kids who are pure inattention, who don't have any hyperactivity, and that they're not well described in the DSM. And there's also now a lot of interest in the question of emotional over versus under arousal and aggressive versus non-aggressive kids. So there's lots to be done just on clinical variability, never mind variability on etiology or mechanism. Here's just another, and I'll get into some data now that continues on the theme of the importance of looking at heterogeneity. What I've got here is neuropsychological scores for first-degree relatives of children with ADHD. Not children with ADHD, but their relatives. And the way we've done this score is along the 0 line here. That line is scaled to be the performance of the relatives of typically developing children who themselves had typical scores on neuropsychological tests. And then I've got two other groups. The yellow group is relatives of kids with ADHD, but those ADHD kids did normal on the neuropsychological battery. The green lines are relatives of ADHD kids, and those ADHD kids did not do normal on the neuropsychological test. And for each of these tests, what we're seeing is a nice separation in the relatives between relatives of kids with normal and abnormal ADHD neuropsych scores. If you just look at the DSM groups, you don't get this. What you get is basically a researcher's post hoc theorizing nightmare where we spend a lot of time trying to explain why the results should sort of make sense really if you trust us, but they don't. And here you get a nice clear picture. And the story is that you're getting some validity in the family's data that if you subdivide ADHD into those with and without executive functioning problems, you get some validity to that. So this research is the kind of thing that makes us think that instead of saying that ADHD is an executive functioning disorder, or at least when you come to testing it in the lab, we're going to say that it's a group of kids for whom some of them have an executive functioning disorder and some of them don't. And so we've got two groups of kids there. And this story repeats almost with anything that we do, but it illustrates the point that this can be thought of as a variable disorder fruitfully in terms of family genetic research. All right, a second approach to this is we think in terms of our neural model. What I've put up here is a cartoon of the brain with different brain networks on it, different brain circuits, and we think about ADHD in the brain now not in terms of a single brain region, but in terms of brain networks, integrated networks of brain regions that perform complicated functions to regulate behavior, regulate attention, and regulate mood. And I've put up here 3 circuits in the cartoon. I'll call them a yellow circuit, a blue circuit, and a red circuit for the sake of simplicity. But for the researchers in the room, I'm thinking of the yellow circuit as a dorsal attention circuit that runs between posterior and frontal cortex. I'm thinking of the red circuit as a frontal striatal circuit that particularly runs between the cognitive control circuit, and I'm thinking of the blue circuit as the cerebellar frontal circuit that's going to also be involved in temporal information processing and also in behavior regulation. The theory that we work on in my research is that something happens to disrupt these circuits. We can measure those disruptions in a brain scan, but we can also measure the effects in a computerized task or some kind of task in the laboratory that could potentially become a laboratory test that we want to use. So we're very interested in these low-cost, economical laboratory tests that might index something in the brain. So we try to use tasks that have got a lot of brain imaging validation whenever we can, and then we're going to try to relate those to ADHD symptoms. So we're going to try to use, I'll try to illustrate this approach here. And I'm going to take up this issue of the pure and attentive type. I mentioned this as one of the major debates in the field. Do we have a pure and attentive group, and can we validate that? The problem has been that no one's been able to separate out ADHD and attentive from ADHD combined because we're using the DSM-4 categorizations, and that includes a lot of sub-threshold combined type kids with 4 or 5 symptoms of hyperactivity who aren't that different than combined type kids. And the argument is this is muddying the water. And the typical story with ADHD subtypes on almost any measure you want to use, whether it's neuropsychology or clinical outcomes or treatment response, you name it, is that it can translate into a severity comparison. The ADHD combined type have more ADHD symptoms, and they do worse than the ADHD and attentive type on your various measures. So that's, in a way, that's not a very exciting subtype theory. You give them more symptoms, you get more worse outcomes. That would hope so, but that doesn't really tell us about subtypes. And so some researchers like me are pretty unhappy with the current subtypes for that reason. It's really just a severity scale, not a subtype scale. We want to see subtypes that actually have different deficits to call them subtypes. So we're going to use our circuit model to try to do that with our cognitive tasks here. Create 2 tasks. The first task is designed to look at response suppression, and we hypothesize that it targets a frontal striatal circuit, and we're using a ANIS-CAD task. It's a classic task that's used a lot in ADHD studies. For the second study, we're going to use an attentional task that looks at attentional filtering that we think is theorized to be more related to ADD. So here's the first task. This is a traditional ANIS-CAD task. This experiment is used all the time in studies of impulsivity and cognitive control and brain injury and ADHD. It's not a novel study at all. This is, in fact, we designed it to be a repetitive study of a commonly used task. The child is instructed to fixate here. When the trial starts, they're supposed to not look at this box appearing over here. And we're tracking their eye movements so that when they flick their eyes over here to see this, we can catch that on our monitor. And we know that they committed a little misdemeanor and we caught them making an error. And if they're told to look toward the box, of course, that's easy to do. But if you're told to look away from the box, look over here. It's very hard because this thing captures your attention. That's part of what that attentional circuit is designed to do, is capture your attention when something appears. That's important, but the task here is to override that using that control circuit. So here we have a couple of different outcomes. I first want to show you the response times. This is an important side point that I'll notice for a moment, which is that in ADHD research with children, one of the problems we always have is gauging the motivation of the child in the study. Those of you who work with kids with ADHD know that making you happy is not always the first priority. And so, I'll do your stupid study for a minute, maybe, but if I get bored, I might change my mind. And so we tend to see often a response pattern that might look like a deficit, or it might be they just didn't care very much about our study. And we don't want to call that a deficit. So we want to pay a little bit of attention to response patterns. With adults, we actually have the opposite problem. In adult ADHD, The adults come in very motivated because they're thinking about ADHD and they want to help our study, and the control people just give me my money and let me out of here. So it's the opposite problem of motivation. But here it's children. Here it's a careful task. You're supposed to go slow and not make any mistakes. You've got to move your eyes in the right direction. So the delayed response on the reaction time means they're trying. And what we're seeing here is a very encouraging pattern where there's no evidence that the ADHD group is trying any less hard than the control group. They're showing similar response time. So to the extent the cognitive scientists in the room know that's not a perfect indicator of effort, but it's at least a poor man's indicator of some kind of degree of task engagement, and it's similar in the group, so it's at least a positive sign. Despite that, the ADHD groups make more errors than the control group. This is no surprise. Like I say, this is not a novel study. We show this all the time, and different people have shown, 4 or 5 other studies have already shown this. But we want to show here that in this sample, in fact, we see the classic problem. And the important point here is that the typical pattern appears. The combined type group makes the most errors, the inattentive group is next, and the control group is last. So it's the typical severity picture. So far, our pure ADD group isn't doing any different. But our ADD group here is indeed a different group than DSM. Here we used a group that has got no symptoms of hyperactivity. They're just inattentive. They're really very, very low in their symptoms, and yet they're right in the middle like they should be. So this looks like a typical finding. Now we go to our second task, where we do something a little novel that hasn't been done before, or it's been done again now, but at the time we did this, it hadn't been done before. And here we use a task borrowed from cognitive psychology. It's a very familiar task to cognitive psychologists, but it's not used in ADHD very much. And this is what's called a rapid serial presentation task. The child's at the computer. These letters appear right in a row, K, P, E, F. They come by really fast, about 8 or 9 per second. So you barely can spot them. As they're going by, you're asked, what was the blue letter? That's the simple part of the task. And it's pretty easy to tell it was an L. People tend to do pretty accurate in that, whether they have ADHD or not. Then we make the task harder. We ask them what the blue letter was, and we ask, was there a Z? And we vary the timing of the Z so that it can appear right after the blue letter, or it can appear at these various spots afterwards. Each of these is about 100 milliseconds as you go out. And there's a well-known phenomenon in cognitive psychology where if you put this probe right after the blue letter, people miss it. They're picking up the blue letter, and then for that split second, for the sake of argument, you can say they're busy noting that, processing that information, if you will, although there's debates about what's actually happening there, but that's one heuristic way to think about it. And they miss the Z. But then if the Z comes out over here, they see it again. So there's what's called an attentional blink here that's involuntary, where you miss the Z if you're doing the task. Now, of course, you can manipulate this by saying, I'm going to ignore the Z or I'm going to ignore the blue letter. But if you're trying to do the task, you miss the Z. So our question was, this type of attention is different. It's something that maybe is different in inattentive ADHD kids. And in fact, we do see a pattern kind of like that. Here's the first easy part of the task. Just what was the blue letter? And you can see all the groups are having no problem. They're all above 90% accurate there. Then we go back and we ask them, was there a Z? The control group is the purple group here, and they show the classic attentional blink. You can see that when the Z comes out 200 or 300 milliseconds, they drop down to chance detection, 50% detection of the Z. Was there a Z, yes or no? They're guessing. They missed it. Then as you get back out to 400 or 500 milliseconds after the blue letter, they can detect it again. That's the attentional blink in the control group. The combined type group, they're kind of blinking, but they're not really recovering. We wish we had done more points out here to see if they come up here later. But there's no statistical difference. The combined type group is down here. Maybe they're abnormal, but the important point is they're real different than the ADD group. Both groups are. The ADD group is the outlier group. They're doing something abnormal on this task. And they're actually filtering the Z in, not gating it out. And this could be a slight strategy difference, but without getting into that nuance, I'm just going to leave a very simple conclusion here that there's something different about the pure inattentive group, suggesting that, again, we've got 2 types of ADHD at the level of cognitive processing that we can pursue if we divide the kids differently than DSM does, if we divide them into pure inattentive versus combined, not the DSM group. So this is a second kind of evidence for the value of subtyping ADHD and not using them all as one group. All right, now I'm going to go at a final piece here, or another piece here, which is the question of emotion regulation and arousal. And there's a couple of background pieces here. Debate in the literature that I mentioned, I was talking about this with one of the faculty here this afternoon. It's been argued for decades whether kids with ADHD are over-aroused or under-aroused. They're running around the room, they seem over-aroused, but oftentimes you measure them with physiological equipment and they're under-aroused. Their EEGs are slow wave or their heart rates are low and those kinds of things. That's been a big debate. There's been recent interest in emotion processing because even though it's been a cognitive disorder for 20 years, an attention disorder, kids with ADHD are kind of a mess emotionally too. And there's lots of tantrums and breakdowns and crises and so on, and anxiety disorders, and later in life suicide attempts and depression. It's lots of emotional dysregulation that goes with ADHD. And ADHD also predicts antisocial behavior. And there's a literature on low heart rate and parasympathetic signaling in antisocial behavior. So there's lots of reasons to kind of be curious about whether we can subtype ADHD kids based on autonomic arousal. And that was what we tried to do in this study. So here we used a novel task that I'll walk you through for a second. We used pictures. The kids are sitting in front of a screen. They're hooked up with electrodes. They're looking at pictures that are boring, pictures of a lamp or a table, and they're rating those pictures. These are standard pictures that have standard affective codes. Then they watch a movie. And it's a movie about the two dogs and a cat that are on a journey. And the first part of the movie is, they watch about 10 or 15 minutes of the movie. We just pick a clip out. First part, the animals are in trouble. One falls down a mine shaft, and you kind of get nervous watching it. Like things might not work out. And then the second half, things are good. They all come home, and everybody's happy, and it's kind of a relief and a celebratory, and you feel good watching that part of the movie. So we asked the kids to rate the movie. Did they think it was sad or happy or what in these sections? And this held up really well. The ADHD kids and the control kids all both agreed really strongly that they felt worse during the negative part than they did during the positive part. That validity held up pretty well. Then we also asked a manipulation, asked them to suppress how they felt. During the first part of the movie, go ahead and get into it. Show me that you feel the same way the characters do in the movie. Then they were told that, don't let me see how you feel. So they were supposed to kind of control their emotion. This is exerting that regulatory demand. So we ended up with 4 segments: positive and negative emotions, match the emotion, and suppress the emotion. All right, and we had two physiological measurements. The first, these are all heart rate measurements of one sort or another. The first physiological measurement is a regular ECG measurement, and it's looking at a measure called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. This is an index of vagal tone. In everyday terms, this means how much is this making you work emotionally or cognitively? How much are you having to engage with this and to deal with it? We see this kind of measure go up the first part of the school year when kids are engaging with new school and having to engage. We see it on hard tasks. It's a general measure of regulatory engagement. I crudely think of it as top-down regulatory effort on the task. And we have in the middle here, again, the control group is right here, this line here. And you can see for the control group, we're seeing exactly what we should have seen. Negative emotions take more regulatory effort to handle than positive emotions down here. And suppressing takes more regulatory effort than not suppressing. So the control groups makes perfect sense from what we would expect with the sequence. And by the way, I've got continuous lines here, not bars, because we continuously recorded these signals and just arbitrarily divided it up. For the ADHD group, that's we think is not emotionally dysregulated, and I'll tell you how we divided these guys up in a second. We see a similar pattern, somewhat muted, but they're basically showing a pretty normal regulatory response, just a little bit less strong. But we have another ADHD group here that's showing a very abnormal regulatory response on this task. And we divided this group out using a clinical measure of pro-social interest, to what extent these kids sympathized and empathized with other children. And we're seeing here that if we can use that clinical measure to group the kids into those that parents and teachers agreed, using ratings from both informants, that these children were unusually indifferent to other kids' well-being. They're ADHD plus emotionally indifferent in some sense. They're not showing any emotional response here. and they're seeing a dramatic behavioral difference. So these kids are, if you will, under-responding. They're facing very little regulatory demand. This movie is not inspiring them emotionally to need to react. It's almost like it's not touching them emotionally. We took a second physiological measure. This is the pre-ejection period. This is a sympathetic heart rate response as opposed to a parasympathetic response. And we think of this as an index of baseline arousal or bottom-up arousal. It's also got regulatory implications, but for the sake, again, of just heuristically here explaining this, I'm going to treat this as just a measure of how aroused they are overall as they face this task, not regulatory demand per se. And here again, what we're seeing is in the control group here, their arousal levels are a little bit more, and this is a reverse score. Notice more arousal is down here. This scale is reversed deliberately. So for the control kids, they kind of relax a little bit in the positive emotions and a little bit more aroused in the negative emotions, and these are compared to baseline. But then we have the ADHD group split up, and what is nice here is the ADHD kids are on both sides of normal. One group is over-aroused, and one group is under-aroused. And so we got two ADHD groups, over and under-aroused ADHD groups, based on emotional division of the kids. So a third example of the value of differentiating kids with ADHD on both a clinical and a physiological parameter. Say it's not all one condition, but the conditions don't divide up according to DSM-4 types, but they do divide up if you look at the right kind of divisions. So we have potential here to go after new targets in genetic or etiological studies. But let me get on to the etiology. So we've talked about the fact that there's some different mechanisms, different groups of ADHD, but one of the challenges in the literature with ADHD is we tend to, researchers like me and others, we tend to do studies like I just showed you, and we'll say there's an autonomic difference or a neuropsychological difference or a brain difference, and then we'll announce that we've discovered the cause of ADHD, when in fact all we've done is measure the phenotype at another level of analysis, but we haven't explained why it exists. We haven't done anything about cause. So I'm trying to persuade my colleagues to quit saying that. And the cause came earlier. Why does the child have different arousal, or why do they have different executive functioning? Why do they have changes like this? Is it in the genes? Did they inherit this from me? Is this because I dropped them on their head when they were little? Is it my fault? Why is this happening? So there's been a big interest in the etiology, and I want to talk about this for the rest of the time. There's no question that ADHD has high heritability in twin studies. I should have put autism on here for this group, but those of you who do autism know autism is up there as well, right in this range. Autism also very, very heritable. But what's striking here is that the developmental conditions like ADHD and autism have a very high heritability in twin studies. MZ twins, identical twins, are much more alike than non-identical twins here. Much more so than can be explained only by environment. So there's some kind of genetic role in these conditions, and it's much stronger than it is for other medical conditions for which we already are making progress on the genetics, like breast cancer, where there's been some breakthroughs on genes, and it's not nearly as heritable as these conditions are. These data led for probably, I'd say, roughly from the mid-90s to 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, the field, maybe even from the early 90s, led my field of research to pretty much think the whole thing was genetic and to pursue that pretty much all out. And we saw an explosion of research on molecular genetics. And I had many people tell me, experts in the field at that time, that there's no point in studying the environment because this is obviously a genetic condition. And this has been the kind of model for quite a while. And there is some follow-up here that I just want to mention, which is there is some progress on that front. We do have a half a dozen confirmed genes associated with ADHD. We do have one genome-wide linkage effect now in the literature. We don't have any association effects in genome-wide studies, which was a major disappointment in the field and probably one of the biggest perceived failures in the last 10 years in the field of genetic research in ADHD is that no one expected that, I don't think. And certainly if you look back to what people were saying in the late 90s, there was a lot of optimism that these genome-wide association studies would show effects. And I have colleagues that can make some fairly painful reminders to people of what they were saying 10 or 15 years ago about how likely this was to work. Many people have forgotten what they said back then, but some of my colleagues remember and quote it back, and it makes for some squirming in the seats. So these gene effects were overhyped at that time, and this has puzzled people. Now in autism, of course, you're seeing some exciting findings looking at rare variants, looking at new mutations. There's some real exciting developments there where a certain percentage of autism cases seem to be related to particular genetic mutations. Although there's going to be a ceiling on that. We're probably not going to explain, I think my autism colleagues would agree, we're probably not going to explain all of autism by these rare mutations. There's going to be a ceiling there, but we are getting some headway. ADHD isn't there yet. That literature is just coming online for ADHD. We don't yet have real breakthroughs in terms of copy number variants or rare mutations, but it's going to happen. It's coming down the pike. The sequencing studies are starting. We're part of a consortium now of 10,000 ADHD samples going in for the exome chip, which is a new chip that's been developed based on exome sequencing data that can look at virtually almost all of the functional variants in the genome. So there's high optimism again that we'll see something exciting from putting 10,000 samples through this chip. But nonetheless, despite some progress here, the bottom line is that we haven't got a genetic magic bullet here, and there's some feeling that we may not ever get that. It may not quite look that way in ADHD. Why is that? Why do we have high heritability but no molecular genetic breakthrough? Well, one possibility is we're looking in the wrong place. One possibility is it's rare variants. But that's probably not the whole story. So here's a couple of points about environments that are a caution here. One puzzle here at the top is there's lots of persistent environmental findings that keep kind of bothering people. Every time we see these long population prospective studies, we find these strong predictive correlates for environmental toxins, whether it's organophosphates or lead. We see it for family stress, parental stress during pregnancy. And we tell ourselves, if we're geneticists, many of us have said, well, that's probably just a proxy for genetic risk. The family with the genetic risk is getting more lead in their home, or they're more stressed. And maybe that's true, but it's maybe not. That's something we have to find out empirically. We can't just assume that that's true. A second and probably more important point is that gene by environment effects can look like heritability. And there's now some new, just in the last 10 years, there's been some recent work kind of clarifying this to the field. This was known, it's been known since the 40s, but it's been forgotten. And it's been brought back to the fore in the last decade in the genetics literature, that gene by environment effects are very important. And gene by environment effects have now become a major focus for studies of externalizing behavior problems like aggression and conduct problems and ADHD, as well as depression. So there's a lot of interest in common psychopathology being related to gene by environment effects. I'll say more about that in a second. There's also a lot of excitement now about epigenetics and epigenetic mechanisms that leads to more interest in the environment. And as a result, in a sense, the field is swinging back, and certainly we are in my lab we always were somewhat interested in environment effects. We've been doing lots of genetic work as well, but our interest in the environment is getting stronger as we think about the dynamics of these effects in development. I want to pause for a moment just to convince you for sure about these gene by environment effects in the heritability term. I want to make sure that there's nobody saying they don't believe that. And so I'm going to show you some data from infectious disease. And this is twin data on tuberculosis. Tuberculosis used to be thought to be a genetic condition because it runs in families. And eventually, of course, that was proven false. It's from a bacteria. It still runs in families. And it also is more concordant and identical than non-identical twins. And the heritability here, if you average across several studies, comes out not that different than ADHD's heritability. And in fact, there's still a large active research in the world on the genetics of tuberculosis, genetics of malaria. That work is quite vibrant these days. But they're obviously not asking for the genetic cause of the disease, right? We know the disease is not caused by genes. They're asking for the genetics of liability or vulnerability or susceptibility to the disease. Some people get tuberculosis when exposed to the tuberculous bug and some don't. And 70% of that variation is due to variation in genotype. That's what this is telling us. 70% of that variation in who's vulnerable to the bug when they get exposed to it. Now, I just want to caution you that I'm not claiming that ADHD is an infectious disease, and I'm also want to recognize that you can't fully use infectious disease as a model for psychopathology. There's unique confounds in infectious disease in twin studies. For example, identical twins tend to spend more time together socializing than non-identical twins do, and that's an obvious confound here because that would cause them to transmit the disease more. But you can take those kind of confounds into account, and you still get this pattern. And there's a review paper that anybody that's interested, let me know, and I can send you this paper. But this is now 30 years ago, but it's a nice summary of that older literature, kind of working through those confounds and showing that, in fact, even if you take all that into account, you still get a significant heritable component to liability to tuberculosis. So this raises the possibility that what the twin studies are showing us for ADHD is really the heritability of susceptibility to ADHD, and that environmental triggers are activating the condition in vulnerable children. This would mean that what parents are passing on or inheriting in the family is the vulnerability to ADHD, but then whether it develops depends heavily on the developmental environment in those vulnerable children. Some children are immune to this. They're not going to get ADHD even in an adverse environment, but others are. That's the gene by environment story. That's the epigenetic story. That's kind of the model that we're working on. All right, that brings up a major question. Which environments are we talking about? Well, this audience, I'm sure, could make many suggestions on that. I hear many suggestions in my travels. I'm going to share those with you now. I get some of those suggestions when I'm traveling on airplanes. Probably some of you sat next to me and told me what the cause is, and I'll give you a few examples. I've noticed that many people are sure about this already, and they're not alone. I mean, some of the research community is sure too, and so there's some good arguments about this. It's a healthy area for debate, and it's a good hypothesizing that happens here for sure. So I want to run through some examples of what might be the environmental causes we should look at. The first one is a kind of a sociological perspective. I put a little bit of tongue-in-cheek here about collapse of civilization, but it's not entirely tongue-in-cheek. There are secular trends and variation in children's problems. Children's behavior problems do get worse some decades than others. There does seem to be a way in which economic conditions and social conditions do modulate children's mental and behavioral problems. So there is a grain of truth in the collapse of civilization theory that families are stressed, the economy is stressed, so kids are behaving worse. But it's not a strong predictor. There is a trend there, but it's not a very strong effect. Too much pharmaceutical marketing is a big concern among a lot of people. There's a sociological literature on this about medicalization and marketing of medications, especially since about 1991 when the laws on this in the United States were changed and it became possible to market direct to consumers, and we saw a spike in psychiatric medications from that time. So this is a big concern in my field, and many people both in the advocacy community and the professional community argue about this, pro and con. Are we under-medicating or over-medicating? We can come back to that in the question period, but suffice to say this is a sociological theory that you can read about in the sociology literature that some people believe may be a factor in ADHD. Another common belief or theory is that this is a problem in caregiving or parenting, that parents are overindulgent. I was talking at lunch with some of the postdocs that there's a new book out that if we only parented more like the French, we wouldn't have these problems. I don't know if you've all seen that book, but if parents would just get a little more serious about their kids, this would go away. There's a similar theory about teachers being inexperienced and too quick to refer rather than get control of their classroom. And you've probably all heard these theories. I've certainly heard them many times. And there is a little bit of empirical literature relevant to these theories. For example, in the parenting piece, there's been a couple of nice studies now showing that indeed, if you videotape parents with children with ADHD, and those of you that are parents will probably be the first to admit this, the parenting behavior is not always at its best. And so you can see on the videotapes evidence that the parents are doing things that maybe are not to the child's advantage all the time, and this can make the parent feel guilty that I should have done this different. And the same thing with teachers. You can videotape the teachers in the classroom, and you can catch the teachers giving their full attention to the misbehaving child and ignoring the well-behaving children, which is the opposite of what they were taught to do, but they can't help it because this misbehaving child is making a pretty compelling case for getting some attention right now. by doing serious damage to something that can't be allowed. But these seem to be child-driven effects to a large extent by school age. When children with ADHD are medicated, and then we look at the parents before and after the child, and when you medicate the child, the parenting behavior improves. And if you swap out the parents, if you take parents of ADHD and put them in with typically developing children, those parents look like they're parenting normally. And if you take parents of normal kids and put them in with ADHD kids, those parents don't look like very good parents. And frankly, you can take a professional like me who's outstanding skills with children, and these children will be able to make me look like I don't know what I'm doing, all right? And so there are definitely child-driven effects here that have to be taken into account. It doesn't mean that the parenting shouldn't be addressed. When we get parenting to be stronger, we can often make a difference for kids with ADHD. So it's very important for parents not to feel like this is untouchable. It is touchable. You can make an effect, but it's not the cause. It's not the cause. It's maybe help maintain it. It's part of how you can interrupt it, but it's not the cause. It's not how it all started. And the same goes for teachers. You can do things in the classroom to make it better, but the teacher is not the sole explanation for the difficulty, at least by school age. Now, I was talking again at lunch with some people. This is not known in early life, but at least by school age, these effects are heavily child-driven. A final area that's important is the developmental context. And I'm going to skip to the last part of that, where we're talking about dietary factors, toxicant factors, these biological insults that I'm becoming convinced play a role in ADHD by altering neural development in subtle ways in vulnerable children in a gene-by-environment manner. And I want to focus on those a little bit in the last few minutes of the talk. All right, here's an example of a gene-by-environment interaction in ADHD, and this is a very simple one. We've shown this as one of our studies. Several other people have shown similar effects. What's happening here is that we've asked the children to rate the level of conflict between the parents. And a little bit of disturbing news for all of those of us who are parents is that the children's rating of the parents' conflict is more accurate than your own. So we use the children's ratings of parent conflict. And we divided the children here. For the sake of illustrating this was a correlational analysis, but the low conflict and high conflict families, here the children are actually reporting their perception that the parents are arguing about them. And we have some evidence that that's some validity to that, although it's also partly the child's temperament causing that rating. But for now, we'll call it, for the sake of argument, we'll call it parent conflict. And then we've also divided the kids based on genotype, and here we're using the dopamine D4 receptor gene, the gene that we know is associated with ADHD. We just divide the kids into those with and without the risk allele. And we get a very simple interaction here showing that if the conflict between the parents is low, there's no genetic effect. But if the conflict is high, there is a big genetic effect. Or if you prefer to look at it the other way, if you have the low-risk gene, you're impervious to some extent, partially impervious to that family conflict, but if you have the high-risk gene, you're very sensitive to that conflict. So this is an example of a growing literature suggesting that genotype affects susceptibility to these environments in children. And this is a simple example on one gene. These effects are not huge. They don't explain the whole thing, but they illustrate the concept that we want to kind of see if we can put the genes and the environments together rather than arguing that it's one or the other. We want to try to make the connection here. All right, I want to talk a minute about toxicants. And this model here, just to remind you, is that something in the development is influencing brain development. Here we're studying lead. We like lead because it's got robust correlations with ADHD and because it occupies and changes gene expression in the striatum in animal studies. And the striatum is a part of the brain that we're very interested in for ADHD, and we have lots of cognitive control tasks that we know depend on intact striatal functioning. So in this example, I'm going to see if I can fit this model. ADHD and lead goes back to the 1960s. This is an old story, but what's happened is we've regulated lead in this country now. We've gotten rid of a lot of lead. If you look at the population blood lead levels in kids in the United States, it's dropped dramatically. This is an example of for better or for worse, an example of successful regulation, where that we've really gotten rid of a major health hazard successfully. Blood lead levels are way down, and as a result, lead poisoning is way down in the United States. It's still a big problem in a lot of the world. But that said, we still find lead in the blood of every single kid we see. I think we've tested about 300 kids for lead in our study, and only 2 didn't have detectable levels. So you can still detect lead in everybody's blood. This is partly because our detection sensitivities are much better than they were 20 years ago. We can detect lead levels that would have been marked as undetectable 20 or 30 years ago. The measurements have gotten better. And we're now at a level here where I've got here the national average blood lead level, which is about 1 microgram per deciliter here. That's a very small amount. And it's only 1/10 of the action level that we have clinically. So 10 is the action level, way up here, kind of pulling an Al Gore here, way up there. And then we're way down here. So these are safe levels of lead in the population. Nobody's clinically going to be concerned about this. And we've seen this now in 2 separate samples that we've gotten, and 1 national sample that was gotten by the Cincinnati group, and another sample in Michigan that was collected by another group besides us. Despite these low levels, our entire sample is right around the national average. There's a little bit more lead in the blood for the kids with ADHD. In this case, it's ADHD combined type. And this keeps showing up over and over. So there's a little bit of association there, and suggesting to us that maybe lead is still playing a part of the story. Now, the reason this is interesting, in particular to me, is that lead is found in all the kids, which means it's a universal environmental exposure at this level, which means if it's interacting with genotype, it's going to look like a genetic effect in twin studies, because the reason kids are going to vary is not because they got some lead, but because they had genetic susceptibility to ADHD that the lead triggered. This is hypothesized. I'm not claiming that, but that's an hypothesis. So we're very interested in this lead correlation. And in fact, we can see that genes do affect lead level. Here I'm using an iron gene called HFE gene that affects iron metabolism. Iron and lead compete at various binding sites in the gut and in the body. So here, depending on your genotype on this gene, you have more or less lead in your blood at an effect that's about the size of the ADHD effect. And so there's just a footnote here that you can also look at gene by environment effects on lead uptake as well as lead effects on ADHD, something that we're looking into. But I want to point out here mainly right now that these effects fit into our cognitive model. If we associate lead with ADHD, here hyperactivity is the stronger association, so we focus on that. We've got a couple of cognitive tasks, one called stop signal reaction time, one that's just response variability, a topic you're going to hear about next month from Dr. Castellanos. And those are both tasks that require intact striatal functioning for their performance. And the lead level, the effect of lead on ADHD is fully explained by its effect on these cognitive operations, which makes us interested now in looking at actual neural operations, neural functioning in relation to this, even at these very low levels of lead. So this is an interesting, again, just an illustration of the kind of things we want to find out. It's too small of a sample, not yet replicated, to take this home and say we know this, but it illustrates the kind of approach we want to take, the kind of conclusions we want to be able to try to make, and the kind of questions that we think we should be asking. So first of all, just a couple of summary comments about evolution and then a couple of wrap-up comments, because I want to put this in the context of how ADHD develops. One of the considerations here is that ADHD is a trait. It's a continuum that we divide into a disorder, and we're trying to find real types. And one of the arguments and questions is it just a trait? Is it just arbitrary? This goes back to the question of whether we're over-pathologizing. There's also this question about whether there's changing tolerance in society and whether we're seeing new genetic mutations. This is another unknown. But there is also a lot of evidence for perinatal problems, perinatal injuries. So I think that some of ADHD is not just genetic variation, but gene by environment injury effects. And I'll pause on that point. I will make a comment again at the Mind Institute that there's some interesting parallels in the ADHD and autism literatures in terms of some of these questions. Heterogeneity, subtyping is a big question. Some of the gene and MRI findings in autism and ADHD are the same. Some are quite different. Are there subgroups of kids that would actually fall into the same group in terms of brain or genes across these disorders? It's an interesting question. They certainly overlap above chance clinically, and that's an important feature. We're doing work now to look at the ADHD autism overlap. We're looking at hyperactive autistic kids versus ADHD kids without autism. The concluding remarks here are that there's lots of individual differences of work to do in ADHD. We think it's very important to making progress on the etiology is to better describe the phenotype. We think this can be done at multiple levels. We can do it biologically, autonomically, cognitively, and in brain imaging. And we would like to see a kind of paradigm change where we're thinking about biotypes of this disorder that we can validate across levels of analysis and use those to improve assessment and treatment. This has been a goal for a long time in the field, but my sense is that it's becoming a much more focal goal, a much more recognized and agreed upon goal in the field than it was even a decade ago, as we recognize the vitality and the essentialness of doing this to make progress on etiology. And the importance of working across disciplines to do this. I showed you results from different disciplines already, and that's going to remain crucial. I want to thank you. I want to thank my host for this great visit and many collaborators, students, and staff. I've got 40 people working on this project. I've got collaborators all over the place. If they weren't there, I wouldn't have much to say. So really want to thank them and the funding from NIH. Thank you for enduring the heat and for your time, and we'll conclude here for discussion.
Hi, as a parent, I'm immediately going into fix it, right? And so I'm wondering if there's any distinction you've seen or heard in the medication effects of these two subtypes.
Yeah, I think you all heard the question, will medication effects or treatment effects be different? That's exactly the question we want to ask next. So no, nothing yet. There's really the holy grail is to try to predict who's going to respond, as you know, to these treatments and why some kids don't. And we're hopeful that we'll see changes, but that's not been done yet. So that's a key next step. Absolutely.
From an environmental aspect, has studies been done in different parts of the country where people have been more or less in a certain part and not moved around the country to think about environmental concerns? Yeah,
that's a great question. The question is, I kind of rephrase this question. There's kind of some natural epidemiologic work you could do on the environmental theory because lead levels vary, organophosphate levels vary, and so do other environmental risks. And could you look around different parts of the country or different parts of the world, see natural variation in ADHD related to these correlates? Don't think the work's been done. Don't know that you could do it without a pretty hard study. Part of the issue here is you can't rely on identification rates. Ideally, you do a CDC kind of study where you just survey clinics and see who's got the most ADHD everywhere. The problem is that the reason that doesn't work is that the variation in ADHD identification is so heavily driven by provider style that overrides these other effects in terms of actual clinical identification. We did a study in Michigan many years ago when I was there. Actually, Marcia Rapley did the study, my colleague there in Michigan. County by county, the variation in ADHD identification ranged by tenfold. You'd have less than 1% of kids with ADHD in one county. The next county over, you'd have 10 or 12% with ADHD. That's not due to lead. That's due to the clinician differences in clinician availability or beliefs. So to do the study that you're correctly suggesting would be an obvious study to do, you would have to be able to actually go and assess these kids yourself in these different locations and see what the symptoms are. It'd be fascinating if you could design that right, and it's a great idea, but I don't know that anybody's done it. So I can't tell you whether those kind of data would support or not my suggestions here about this environment. Would be a natural way to ask. And the same is true internationally. We've got lots of international data, but nothing that differentiates locally enough to be able to differentiate out these kind of levels that vary so much regionally rather than nationally.
Oh, do you have any comment on the sleep quality these children have had, or studies currently happening on the sleep studies?
Sleep, yeah. Yeah, the question is about sleep and ADHD, and there's quite a literature on this. There's a lot of studies now on sleep and ADHD, and of course it's in the context of most kids don't get enough sleep, or at least if you don't believe the study that came out a few weeks ago or whatever that was about this that created quite a stir. But that there's probably not enough sleep out there. We know that if you don't get enough sleep, you're not very attentive. So there's an obvious potential link. My best take on that literature, And you'll get, any two ADHD experts are going to give you a different take on this literature. I'm amazed at how differently we all evaluate this literature when I go around and talk to my colleagues. But my take on this literature is that if you ask about sleep behaviors, ability to go to bed on time, stay in bed, that there's lots of problems with that in ADHD, and it's a chicken and egg thing. A lot of times families give up and they just, don't bother. It's just too troubling to get them to bed. It's a big fight, and so the kid's all stirred up. But lots of things go wrong at those transitions that make it very hard. And there's room to do interventions around bedtime routines. It's one of the things that we work on with families, is how to make that day, more structured. But sleep-related behavior is definitely related to ADHD. What's causing what? Less clear. Formal sleep disorders, where you do an overnight polysomnography and look for breathing problems or restless leg problems. There's been some studies that have shown that a subgroup of the kids will show up with those problems in ADHD samples, but the samples are small, the results are inconsistent, and I think most ADHD people will say, not a convincing major explanation. But should you check sleep when you see a kid with ADHD? Absolutely. It's one of those things you have to rule out, that you don't want to miss the sleep problem, the metabolic disorder, the obvious explanations for alternative stories. This is one of the obvious alternative interpretations for a child presenting with attention problems.
Hi, I'm Irva Hertz-Pichetto, and I want to actually just thank you very much for singing the same tune that feel like I've been whistling into the wind for the last 10 years on autism and the importance of environment. So it's really good to hear, and it's really good to hear you just laying it right out. And I'll have a chance to talk to you later maybe about how you're working in the profession and where you think the tide is going. I actually wanted to ask, I have a bunch of questions, but let me just ask one related to girls and boys, and not so much environment, but do you see a difference between those two subtypes that you've talked about, the combined and the inattentive, in their proportions in girls versus boys? And does that say anything about genetics, socialization, and it's a broad question. You could.
Yeah, no, but I see what you're asking. No, it's absolutely a good question, and it's interesting. We've looked at that a little bit. Of course, gender of the child, sex of the child is a major issue in ADHD, as it is in autism, as you know, because there's much more boys with disorder than there is girls. In ADHD, the sex difference is not quite as strong as it is in autism. My best take on the population surveys overall is that it's about a 2.5 to 1 boys to girls in the population. But of course, in clinical samples, it's many times that. It's almost all boys that come in. When you look at these subtypes, the traditional view has been that girls are more likely to be in that inattentive group. They're more likely to be that pure inattentive group. And we do see a little bit of that tendency in our sample, but in the studies we did here, that was not significant. We actually had no statistical difference between any of our ADHD subgroups in any of this. And we've been I skipped over the slides on the graph theory modularity analyses, where we're actually using these mathematical models to naturally group the kids into groups. And when we do that, we see these nice variations in symptom profiles and in neuropsych profiles, but no association with gender or sex. So far we're seeing that the subtypes are not grouping by sex specific. That said, the girls are later to be diagnosed. They are overlooked more. They are more at risk for depression and suicide attempts, and they are less likely to get picked out of class for disruption and more likely to be overlooked for being inattentive and spacey and falling behind. So there are important gender variations here, and especially I think when you get into adolescence and adulthood, there's really no literature on girls and women with ADHD and the unique concerns that may exist for health concerns, dietary concerns, and especially mood problems and depression. So I think it's a really important issue, but these particular subtypes are not picking up gender differences.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about if you see an overlap with dyslexia and bipolar disorder along with ADHD. Is that very common?
Yeah. I'll take bipolar first. The bipolar disorder and ADHD has been a major topic of discussion over the last 15 years. It kind of came on the scene in the mid-90s with some claims that there's a lot of missed bipolar disorder in the ADHD group. This has become reached a crisis point in the field. We had a publication not us, but I mean the field saw a publication 2 years ago, I think, showing that the rate of diagnosis of bipolar illness in children had multiplied by, I think, 100-fold or something in the last 10 years. To obviously some major changes in how clinicians are using that diagnosis, to the point where on the DSM-5 committees, we're feeling like we need to do something about this. You know, there's really some confusion about bipolar in children, and that's intruding into the ADHD world where people are asking if the ADHD child actually is bipolar. And the reason for this problem is that this literature initially in the 90s was saying that in children, you don't see mania, you see irritability. And the result was that highly irritable children were getting called bipolar. And that was wrong. That's false. You know, that you follow those irritable children forward, they do not develop bipolar. They do not have bipolar in their family. They develop depression. They do have mood problems, but it's not bipolar. So the field's criteria in the DSM-5 is going to reflect this. If you're going to have bipolar in children, you have to have cycling. You have to have mania, and you have to have cycles. You can't just have irritability, and you can't just have constant, crazy, you know, angry mood. And when you look at it from that point of view, using kind of correct diagnostic criteria, the association of bipolar with ADHD is very weak. Naturally, kids with bipolar, like by the time you do, it will look like ADHD, but there's very little overlap. And in our samples, and I think most other groups show similar. Not all. The Mass General series does show more bipolar in the relatives of ADHD kids, but we don't see that. When we look at, when we study the parents or the relatives of kids with ADHD, we do not see any elevation in bipolar disorder. And other groups that I know besides the Mass General group don't see that either. So I'm not convinced that there's really much genetic connection between bipolar and ADHD. I think there is an overlap of depression and ADHD, but not bipolar. On the learning disability front, and I think you can tell the two apart, there's lots of overlap. There's lots of reasons to get confused because, you know, the irritability is common across both and so on, but at the end, when you do it carefully, they're probably distinct. The dyslexia, learning disability is a big overlap, 30% overlap in both directions. This is above chance. This is a big mystery why this is. There's been lots of work, especially coming out of the Colorado group. Bruce Pennington's group and Eric Wilk have done a lot of good work on the genetic overlaps here. It's probably shared genes, but once you rule out the obvious cases where the child had learning disability and therefore lost interest in school or was inattentive and got falsely labeled as falling behind because of a learning disability, you do see a lot of academic failure. But once you sort those things out, there's probably a shared genes that link ADHD and learning disability, and that's an important clue what's going on. But beyond that, we're working on it. But I think there's been, if you look at the details of that in the Colorado group's work and other groups, some interesting specific findings there, but that's kind of the punchline.
Dr. Nigg, I wondered, there seems to be a lot of talk about omega-3 fats and the effect on children. I also wonder about physical activity or the lack of it. We live in a very artificial kind of environment compared to maybe 100 years ago in some respects. Do you find any connections there with those seemingly, well, at least very well talked about nowadays?
Yeah. We haven't studied those things specifically, but I've reviewed those literatures extensely, so I can sort of tell you what the literature says. And I, of course, when there's no data, I'm free to speculate wildly, which I will not hesitate to do, but I will tell you what is speculation. So first on diet nutrition, we just finished a meta-analysis of nutrition studies of ADHD. It came out in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry in January. Concluding that if you put children with ADHD on a food restriction diet where you remove food additives and toxicants and so on, much to my surprise, I started this study expecting to debunk this thing once and for all. There is a strong effect. It does seem not as strong as a medication effect, but there is a reliable effect. It does look like dietary restriction can help kids with ADHD about 30% of the time. And I'm not sure what else to say about that other than I hope nobody shoots me who's in the been putting this stuff aside for decades, but it's not going away, and it looks like we probably need to revisit. And we're hoping to start an actual intervention trial this year to see if we can actually work into a clinic a protocol for instituting a dietary intervention for ADHD children. The reason this isn't done in part is it's really hard to do. You know, you have to get a nutritionist. The child is not going to like the changes. It's really hard to do it right. You got to go for at least a month to see if it's working. You got huge placebo effects, so if you don't do careful objective measurements, you fool yourself about it. So these nutritional things are real, but they're hard to do in real life in clinical settings. The dietary fatty acids are the same review. We found very little in the way of food coloring as the culprit. It looks like it's more other food additives, or it's general allergy just to allergenic foods, although there's a little bit of a food coloring effect. It's not very big. When you get to the essential fatty acids, we're in the middle of a meta-analysis of that right now. We're just writing that up. So actually we're on top of that literature, coincidentally. And it's the same story, but not quite as strong. You do see clear effects in parent ratings for essential fatty acids, but the teacher effects are much smaller in those. And these are double-blind randomized trials where you're giving the fatty acids and seeing if it affects the ADHD symptoms. And those studies seem to see, and when you see that kind of pattern where you see it in parent but not teachers, you got to worry about that the blinding in the study somehow didn't work, or else that there's different behaviors being detected in the home but not the school. I think what we're going to end up concluding in that paper, and we haven't finished going through all the data, but my hunch is we're going to conclude that there is some small effect of fatty acid intervention in ADHD, and it's probably in a subgroup, if we can figure out who it is, it's helping some kids. It's probably a big effect in some kids. And I think the gene bioenvironment is going to become very important here. Jim Stevenson's group in Britain published a nice study last January in the Journal of Child Psychology Psychiatry, and again, I can send it to you, showing nice interactions between histamine genes and food additives in predicting ADHD symptoms. The subgroup with the histamine gene allele showed a big response. The other showed no response. So if we can nail down the gene-environment interactions, we might, I don't think it's out of the question. I mean, I'm going out on a limb here, and a lot of my colleagues would say this is not a mainstream comment at all, but I think it's plausible to say that in 20 years we'd be able to do gene by environment food interventions. I think that'd be very exciting by way of, low-tech intervention. I don't think it's out of the question. We're not there, but the data don't rule that out, and they actually suggest it could be promising. The big problem is the smallness of the effects. And so if you don't find the right kids to do it with, it's not going to be a big enough effect to get you out of the woods with the problem. And so you've got to find the right kids, and you're going to have you're still going to have 30% success, 70% failure. The inverse of medications, where you have 70% success, 30% failure. And so to go through that failure, that all's got to be weighed. But this is something I want to follow. I think it's got prospects down the road, and it's ironic after all this time. But your second question about exercise, you brought up the broader issue of there's been a lot of change. If you look at even a diet, there's interesting literature on this, the changes in the United States diet, not just from prehistoric times to now, but even in the last 30 years. Some genetic changes in children's diets, and of course obesity shot up, and we get all these other things going on in children. At the same time, the activity levels and exercise. So there's not a lot of good literature on exercise, activity, video watching, and this kind of thing in ADHD. This is an area where we hear lots of speculation. And from an armchair point of view, this seems like it should be relevant, but it's hard to get good studies to demonstrate it. There's a nice study being done in Vermont now. Betsy Hose is doing a study asking whether exercise interventions can help kids with ADHD. It would seem sensible that it ought to be of some help. And as one thing that I tell parents is if your child's not getting any exercise, not getting enough sleep, let's take care of that before we start spending a lot of energy on other interventions. But I just don't know the answer. I just think it's fascinating to ask. And kids with ADHD are lower on fitness. There's some evidence that if they're not medicated, they're more likely to gain weight and those kinds of things. But it's a big unknown to me. Yeah.
Hi, you mentioned the overlap between children with dyslexia and ADHD. Is it a common occurrence that children with do you know if some children with just dyslexia are then misdiagnosed with ADHD? I'm trying to, as a parent of one of these children that has been diagnosed with both, trying to figure out what things are related to which disorder and whether the second one is a correct diagnosis.
Right. I've certainly seen cases where they were called ADHD and the learning disability was missed. That can certainly happen. And it's also possible to have just a learning disability and present as if you have both. Usually in that picture, the history runs something like this when I do the interview, that he seemed fine, but when he started school, he had ADHD. And now I'm seeing that at home, I'm seeing it too, and I don't know why this is starting. But then upon further questioning, well, it's really around the homework, and it started, but now it's spreading, and now everything is a struggle. And it gradually, kind of fans out as the child develops this really quote-unquote attitude problem where they're getting demoralized and frustrated and stuff. So when I see that kind of history and I see the right psych testing profile, I begin to suspect that we may be more learning disability than learning disability plus demoralization and frustration versus learning disability plus ADHD. When we have both, we're typically going to see early developmental history where we had problems managing the child in preschool, delays not just in language learning, but also in other areas of development, trouble making friends, trouble getting along with kids, trouble in the home, even before school started. And even in kindergarten and first grade, before they had to learn to read, they were still already struggling to get along and to follow instructions and all that kind of stuff. And now on top of it, they're not able to read. And that's when I start to worry about having both. But the ultimate answer is in the psych testing profile. You have to look at that. You have to see that you've got the profile where you've got the learning disability, rule that in or out. And then so if the child is first, second grade, I can often tease it apart. If I've got a fifth grader, I may never be able to figure it out because both problems are now entrenched, and you can't tell for sure which came first. But either pattern can happen. The biggest issue is get the learning disability addressed, and if you get the positive attitude in school, you might be able to turn that around. But if they can't pay attention, they can't learn. So you may have to do both. Yeah.
Okay, as an adult, if you've decided you've got ADHD, where do you start? What's UC Davis doing? Have they any, clinics or?
If you're an adult who wants clinical services, talk to Dr. Schweitzer.
Yes, we do.
Or if you want to make a comment, go ahead.
To the Mind Institute website and put in Google Mind Institute ADHD. They have a clinical page that has their phone number, how to contact us, and make an appointment. And we're actually starting a group for adults with ADHD as well to teach strategies and so forth. We're going to start one in the next few weeks, but we're going to have them every 6 weeks or so. So we'll have plenty. Right, and then you'll go to our clinical services page and you'll see where you make the phone number to make an appointment.
I have a son with ADHD, and my question was, chelation, does that really help with lead levels, reducing lead levels, and will that make a difference?
Yeah, chelation is a medical intervention to take lead out of the blood, and it's a very strong intervention. I kind of think of it as chemotherapy for kids. It's a very risky, major intervention for a child. It's a question for your physician. If the lead levels are the level I showed you here, I would not be inclined to do it with my child because their side effects and risks are so high. And the lead levels here are so low that what we're seeing here are population effects that I don't know are going to be strong enough in an individual case to make that risk worth it. If your child's got 20 or 30 or 40 milligrams of lead in their blood, then that's a different story. Or if they're sick, with stomach aches and everything from lead, that's a different story. But if they're not sick, if there's not a medical causes, most clinicians are going to advise you not to do chelation in that case. And I would agree. So, but talk to your doctor about that. But that's a major intervention not to be taken lightly.
There are some evidence or ideas out there that when you put up an ADHD person in a multitask environment or even in front of a computer, they can perform as good or even better than normally developed people. What do you think about those findings?
Yeah, so the question is whether ADHD brings with it a strength in terms of multitasking or handling lots of information at once. And I've heard this too, but I've not actually seen any data on that. So if you have any actual studies, I would like to see them. Mike, we've typically not seen, we've seen that the subjective perception is that I'm good at that, but when we actually measure it, it's not there. And the study that most impressed me, this is one that Rosemary Tannick did, was a video game study where because the other issue is the motivation. And this video game study, she got children with ADHD and typically development kids who love to play video games, got them equal on IQ and equal on things like years of experience and the amount of time they played and that kind of thing, and created a video game for them to learn and play. And it was very engaging. They loved doing it. They wanted to do it. And the ADHD kids felt they were very good at it. But in fact, they didn't do as well as the typically developing kids on it. And so I think that I'm not convinced that there is that extra ability in the ADHD groups on average. It doesn't mean there's not individuals that might be called ADHD, but that actually have a real strength there. And you certainly will see, brilliant, especially some of the high IQ ADHD individuals and some of the historical figures with ADHD, the learning disabilities, you see this where they have ADHD, they're bad in school, but they're brilliant at sales or marketing or entertainment or whatever their field is, where they really have that ability. But I think on the average that these children are mostly, it's hard to find those strengths. And I say that not to be discouraging, but to recognize the importance of addressing this as a disorder or a disability. But that's an important issue. There's a growing literature on creativity, and is this an issue for some kids that they're more creative? And this is still in a question mark, but if you have studies on this, I'm interested in it because this is an ongoing issue.
So two questions. You didn't mention anything about a Tourette spectrum disorder and the overlap with ADHD, and actually an old Biederman paper, I think, showed that about 30% of kids with really severe ADHD can have a history of motor or vocal tics or somewhere on the Tourette spectrum. Mm-hmm. So that's one question. But the second question is, what do you think about some of these intensive computer programs to improve attention and executive function like CogMed or some of the other ones that are out there? Do you think that that's worthwhile to consider?
On the first question on Tourette's, we've stayed away from it. We don't study Tourette's kids. I think it is an interesting subgroup, the Tourette's plus ADHD group. And it may be a genetic type. Some of the research on Tourette's genetically, it's not my area, but it's fascinating, some of the genetics of Tourette's and the overlap with ADHD. And of course, a lot of Tourette's kids have ADHD, and some ADHD kids have Tourette's. For the point of view of ADHD, it's a minor overlap because it's a smaller number than Biederman claimed that actually have Tourette's in the ADHD population. But a lot of the Tourette's kids have ADHD, so I think it's an important subgroup. On your second question about CogMed and related interventions, I've got a lot to say about that. I'll make a brief comment that for those of you that aren't familiar, actually, and I should say the Mind Institute is doing a lot of research on this. So, and you probably know this, and that's probably why you're asking, but for those that don't know this, there's a lot of research at the Mind Institute on CogMed and related interventions, so there'll be more data coming out. But my take on the literature so far is that I'm not very convinced. There's been a history of probably 40 years or 50 years of trying to do laboratory training, certainly since computers came online the last 25, 30 years, a massive literature trying to do computerized training of cognitive skills in aging and dementia, in Alzheimer's, in language learning, in learning disabilities, now in ADHD. And this literature has been very consistent in showing that you can certainly train a lot of cognitive skills. Sometimes you can get what's called near transfer, and again, you know all this, but I'm saying this for the sake of the group. You can get near transfer to nearby cognitive skills, but it's very rare and essentially almost impossible to get far transfer to behavior in the real world in ADHD. Now, Dr. Schweitzer's group is showing me some interesting data today that they may have some data that suggests that there is some far transfer with a CogMed experiment. But the challenge has been to really show effects in the classroom with what's supposed to be an intervention for attention disorders. The teachers just don't see it. And this bothers me as far as being persuaded, especially when I combine that with kind of the hype and the cost of this thing. So my take is that this is a really worthwhile area of investigation. It's got to be done. It's very important to pursue this. It's not there yet. And I'm curious to see where it goes. I'm very interested in this recent work to try to link motor learning with cognitive learning at the same time, kind of this idea that the motor and cognitive systems are connected. It makes a lot of sense to me in terms of neural development and learning development. And so I strongly support this area of work, but I'm not convinced that it's there yet for prime time.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.